In Major League Baseball, players typically have to wait 5 years after leaving the game to become eligible for election into the Hall of Fame. If a person dies, the period shrinks to 6 months, which was the case with Lou Gehrig. But the person most quickly elected to Cooperstown after leaving the game was not a player. It was Commissioner Kenesaw Mountain Landis. In 1944, a special vote was called at Cooperstown, and just 3 weeks after his death, Landis was immortalized in bronze. His plaque reads, "His integrity and leadership established baseball in the respect, esteem, and affection of the American people." Landis was part bloodhound, part bulldog when it came to sniffing out and locking his teeth on gamblers and game fixers. He cleaned up the game, but his programming had a glitch. Landis believed that in order to maintain the decency and purity of the game, he needed to keep the game exactly as it was. What if, while scrubbing away some of the grime, he also swept something massive under the rug? You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there's no loud music, no jarring sounds, only nostalgic, thought-provoking, emotional stories about baseball. I'm Ben Orlando. The lightning-quick vote on Landis's induction into the Hall of Fame should tell you what baseball thought of him. He was the savior in a time when the game could only be seen through a film of dirt and grime. He brought this wonderful sport back to the people. I'm imagining two young parents walking down the street with their child when suddenly a thief runs up and snatches the child. But a hero standing nearby chases the thief, recovers the child, and returns her to her parents. Imagine how grateful those parents would have felt. This is how grateful many Americans felt toward Landis. He recovered baseball and returned it to the fans. That's a pretty heroic gesture. And remember when I talked to author Charles Fountain about the gravity of the 1919 scandal, he said the only possible equivalent in terms of how deeply the American people were affected might be the Nixon Watergate scandal. But even that, Fountain thought, didn't hit people as hard as the Black Sox betrayal of 1919. So in 1920, Kenesaw Mountain Landis inherited a mess. He inherited 40 years of gambling and game fixing woven into baseball. He had to go in and try to pull out all these dirty threads without the game falling apart. A lot of outsiders would have seen the job of commissioner at this time in baseball's state as daunting, overwhelming. And Landis did take his time to deliberate because he also didn't want to give up his job as a federal judge. And he told this to the owners, to which they replied, "Well, keep your judge position. This will only take a couple days a month. Oh, and you're making $7,500 a year as a federal judge? Well, we'll pay you $50,000 a year for a 7-year contract to be the commissioner." How's that sound? This might seem a bit unbelievable when you think about who these owners were. They were the big bosses, the guys who told everyone else what to do. But as Daniel Levitt explained in his article, by 1920, the owners were in open civil war. Owners from the National League had sided with owners from the American League, creating multiple factions. Van Johnson, the president of the American League, was despised by many of the owners. And part of the goal of the owners was to instill a commissioner who had power over Johnson. For any baseball fans who love to dig into the weeds, this whole National Commission disintegration is filled with drama and intrigue. But for the purposes of this episode, I'll just say that by 1920, the governing body of baseball was no more. And suddenly, all of these owners had a bigger problem. Because of Ban Johnson and his feud with White Sox owner Charles Comiskey, the world now knew about the cheating White Sox. There was a criminal trial. Baseball was now corrupt, and the owners had to think fast in order to right the sinking ship. So Landis says he really has to think about taking the job. Then he says, I'll take the job under these conditions, which are basically, I get complete authority and have the final say in all major decisions. When it comes time to tell the owners yes or no, Landis instead tells them a story about his son Reed at a baseball game in Brooklyn. And his son said during this game, quote, Dad, there are millions of little kids who get just as much fun and are made just as happy by clean baseball as this crowd of men and women. Oughtn't something be done to keep the good old game from being taken away from them? End quote. Landis finished his reflection to the owners with, quote, We've got to keep baseball on a high standard for the kids. That's why I took the job, because I want to help. End quote. Now, this all may be true, but let's be real. A colleague of Landis's said of him, quote, There are only three things Landis really cares about. They are fishing, baseball, and his son, Reed. End quote. Sorry, Mrs. Landis, you're not on the list. And what do we know about Kenesaw Mountain Landis? We know he's a schemer. He went out of his way to purchase medals that he pinned on his chest to intimidate his competition in a bicycle race. We know he's a showman. He applied the highest fine ever in an American court to Standard Oil, probably knowing that the fine wouldn't stick. But it was great publicity. We know that he forced the richest man in the world to come out of hiding and sit in his courtroom, even though he really didn't have a good reason to do so, beyond flexing his muscles. And now, he has the chance to become the almighty commissioner of baseball, commissioner of the game he loves more than almost anything in the world. And he's going to make 7 times his yearly salary. To work, the owners tell him, only a few days a month. And he has all the power over this group of extremely powerful men. Is he really deliberating? Or is he maneuvering these owners and the press and the general public to get the most power and most money possible? Landis was probably licking his chops as he stepped into the role. And really, he was like an attack dog let off the leash. According to writer Dan Busby, Landis, quote, had 2 violent passions, a love of baseball and a hatred of gambling, end quote. Did the owners know the depth of Landis's hatred of gambling? Maybe, maybe not. But they knew the depth of his love for the game, because it came out in 1914, 6 years earlier, when Judge Landis was asked to make a ruling in Major League Baseball. And this example gives us a great insight into what he would or would not do in future years. In 1914, the upstart Federal League placed professional ball clubs in many cities with existing Major League clubs. And then they began poaching players. It's irritating, but it's what happens in a free market. Except Major League owners didn't want a free market. They wanted things to stay just as they were, with players trapped under the reserve clause and owners holding all the power. The owners went to court to get their players back, and in some cases, they won. But in one case, a New York State Supreme Court judge sided with the Federal League, basically calling the major league owners a bunch of thugs running a monopoly. This court decision was Christmas morning for the Federal League, who finally saw a crack in the rigged system. Now they had to find a way to pry open that crack. They looked around the country and the federal court system, and they wondered, what judge can we find to break up this monopoly, to create more fair competition? Why, Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis, of course. By 1914, Landis's reputation for courage and fairness was well established. But what the Federal League and most people didn't know was that if Judge Landis had strong feelings about something or someone, he became professionally unreliable. According to historian Harold Seymour, quote, Landis had a keen aversion to organized labor, liquor, and the New Deal. The rub was that he permitted his personal dislikes to warp his judicial objectivity. End quote. When the Federal League came calling to break up the monopoly of Major League Baseball, they were jubilant. They thought they'd found their savior. But they had no idea how big a baseball fan Landis was. He'd played baseball in his youth and followed the game closely ever since. And siding with the Federal League meant hampering with the sanctity of his beautiful game. He wouldn't do it. In the end, the judge who demanded John D. Rockefeller show up in court for the first time in 19 years took no action in this case, which allowed Major League Baseball to triumph and which caused the Federal League to fade into oblivion. This is how Judge Landis was going to make decisions in baseball. When we return to 1920, we have a near-perfect situation for Landis. Game fixing had been going on in Major League Baseball since the very beginning, and the reserve clause and little financial security created more incentive to cheat. Players like Hal Chase fixed games for years throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century, with never more than a slap on the wrist for their crimes. To make matters worse, in 1918, the Wilson administration closed down racetracks across the country. So all the heavy gamblers who normally bet on horses flooded into major league ballparks. The 1919 World Series fix was a culmination of angry players, a gambling underworld that thought itself untouchable, and a system of baseball owners and managers who refused to confront the worsening reality. In October of 1920, 8 White Sox players and several gamblers were indicted by a Chicago grand jury for conspiring to fix the 1919 World Series. In a state of panic and desperation, Major League owners settled on Judge Landis. If this were a paper, I'd include a footnote here about American League President Van Johnson and his efforts to thwart Landis's appointment and basically be a thorn in Landis's side for the rest of his life. If you want to dive into the weeds, you can see my links on Patreon. But by January 1921, Kenesaw Mountain Landis was the new commissioner of baseball, with a 7-year contract for $50,000 per year. He'd been making $7,500 per year as a judge, which is equivalent to $134,000 today, whereas $50,000 then is equal to $900,000 per year today. In saying yes and making this seemingly difficult choice, Kenesaw Mountain Landis had become one of the richest and most powerful men in America. If you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. I just uploaded 2 full interviews. One with actor Timothy Busfield, who played Mark in Field of Dreams, but who went on to have many fantastic roles in film and television, including one of my favorites, Danny Concannon in The West Wing. The second new uploaded interview is with Phil Alden Robinson, the man who wrote Field of Dreams and directed it, and spent years trying to convince the studio to take on the project. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. Everyone just assumed that he'd give up his judgeship to become the commissioner. Everyone except Landis, who said there was still too much to do. So he decided to keep his judgeship. However, he announced, because of his new salary, he would not accept his $7,500 salary for being a judge, which of course seemed like a noble gesture. But here's where the showman and schemer returns. He said he'd forego his $7,500 salary as a judge, but it just so happened that as commissioner, on top of his $50,000 salary, Landis asked for an expense account that totaled, wait for it, $7,500. And oh, this $7,500 was tax exempt. There's a funny story in Pietrussa's book about an excited Chicago bootlegger who hears the news of the judge's appointment to be the new commissioner. The bootlegger walks up to Landis. "Great news," he tells the judge. "Greatest thing to happen to the sport. Just the man they needed. Only thing about it is that it takes you away from the bench. Too bad you gotta quit." To which the judge replies, "I don't have to quit the bench, and I'm not going to quit." To this unexpected reply, the rum runner's face drains. He's speechless until he finally mumbles, "Ah, hell." Imagine today if a Supreme Court justice said, "I want to keep my job as Supreme Court justice, and I want to be commissioner of baseball." Landis was not a Supreme Court judge, but he was by far the most well-known judge in the country. And the commissioner job was an unknown, because one man had never held the position before. He probably could have gotten away with doing both jobs, at least for a while, except for one meddling man, Van Johnson, American League president. Remember, the Black Sox players likely would not have been banned, would not have been prosecuted in a criminal trial if Van Johnson hadn't been feuding with Charles Comiskey. And now he was at it again. He stirred up dissent. He used some of his connections to get people in law to speak out against Landis and what he was doing. And this snowballed. The Senate tried to introduce a bill barring judges from outside employment. The American Bar Association censured Landis, calling his dual role, quote, derogatory to the dignity of the bench, end quote. On February 18th, 1922, Landis resigned from the bench, saying there was just too much to do for one man. From this moment forward, he became solely commissioner. Few of us on earth, and few people who have ever lived, experienced the power Kenesaw Mountain Landis now wielded. And he got down to business. Landis set up this elaborate investigatory network to know what was going on at all times. He met with owners. He met with insiders and, you could say, double agents, people in the game who fed him information. And this is how he learned about Van Johnson's scheming and his real motivations for exposing the 8 White Sox players. So from the start, Landis detested Van Johnson, and Johnson hated Landis for usurping his power. Reading more about Van Johnson, who seemed to create enemies everywhere he went. I'm starting to feel even more sympathy toward Charles Comiskey. In these back and forths between Landis and Johnson, Landis always came out on top. In total, Landis ended up banning 18 players, coaches, and others affiliated with Major League Baseball, including Philadelphia Phillies president William D. Cox for his role in gambling in baseball. And by banning White Sox third baseman Buck Weaver, Landis told baseball and the world that even if you didn't actually cheat, even if you merely overheard someone planning to fix a game and you didn't report it, you are just as guilty. This move worked extremely well because many people at the time thought that Buck Weaver had not been involved, that he'd only overheard something, and wow, he was kicked out of the game for merely overhearing something and not reporting it. But as author Bill Lamb explained, Landis clearly believed that Weaver was guilty of game fixing. When Weaver petitioned for a reversal of his ban in 1927, Landis cited a slew of evidence that marked Weaver as guilty. But Landis didn't say these things in 1921 because he needed Weaver as an example, as motivation to rat out your fellow teammates for fear of getting banned yourself. Players like Gene Paulette, Jimmy O'Connell, and coach Cozy Dolan were some of the casualties of the new policy. And they hadn't actually fixed a game, but only talked about it with some players. But those players told their managers, or they told Kenesaw Mountain Landis. Another victim of this new policy was New York Giants pitcher Phil Douglas, who, unfortunately for himself, put his fix attempt on paper. It was 1922, and Douglas had gripes with Giants manager John McGraw. And he said this and more to an old teammate, Les Mann. Now, Phil Douglas was not the sharpest thinker. First, everyone knew in 1922 what the penalty was for cheating or knowing about a cheater and not reporting it. Still, Phil Douglas wrote out his crime on paper and then sent this incriminating letter to Les Mann, who, it turns out, was one of the most upstanding men in the game. Here's most of the letter. Quote, "Dear Leslie, I want to leave here, but I want some inducement. I don't want this guy," the guy being John McGraw, "to win the pennant, and I feel if I stay here, I'll win it for him. You know how I can pitch and win. So you see the fellows, and if you want to, send a man over here with the goods, and I will leave for home on the next train. Send him to my house so nobody will know, and send him at night. I'll go down to the fishing camp and stay there. I'm asking you this way so there cannot be any trouble to anyone. Call me up if you're sending a man, and if I'm not there, just tell Mrs. Douglas." End quote. So just imagine Les Mann, one of the most upstanding guys in the game, a guy who is certain to report this, opening up and reading this letter. To his credit, Phil Douglas seemed to figure this out, but too late. He called up Mann and asked him to burn the letter. The damage was done. Mann told his manager, Branch Rickey, who advised him to tell Kenesaw Mountain Landis. And when Landis met with Douglas, he asked him point blank, "Did you write this letter?" And Douglas replied simply, "Yes, I did." To which Landis replied, quote, "You know what this means, Phil Douglas. You are permanently out of organized baseball." End quote. For some reason, the gravity of the situation and the inevitable outcome didn't hit Douglas until this very moment. He sat there stunned. And then he went to his hotel, packed his bags, and cried all the way from his hotel to the train station out of town. The odd thing about Landis is his wavering strictness about gamblers and game fixers. According to Dan Busby, Landis despised gamblers. Apparently, he wouldn't let Bing Crosby purchase the Boston Braves because Crosby owned a racing stable. And in a letter to Philadelphia Athletics president Connie Mack, Landis wrote about gamblers, quote, "There is only one thing we can do, and that much we must with these rats, and that is to everlastingly keep after them, throwing them out of the park on their heads every time they come inside." End quote. And yet many of his investigations ended up with, "Did you do it or did you not?" And often if a player said, "I didn't do it," and there wasn't enough evidence, that was that. They were fine. If you did something really dumb, like write a letter and send it to one of the most upstanding guys in the game, you were out. In 1926, when Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker were found guilty of getting caught up in betting, Landis allowed them to quietly resign, and then he allowed them to come back to the game a while later. Some people were confused by the ebb and flow of Landis's wrath, but as legendary baseball owner Bill Veeck pointed out, Landis could have banned dozens more players, but he didn't want too much scandal surrounding baseball. He wanted just enough to show the American people that he was working hard to get out a few bad eggs. Mostly, he granted amnesty to people who were shown to have cheated in the past. But this goes to Landis's prime objective, beyond building his own self-image, was keeping baseball pure and dignified, as he saw it. So, what happened when this pure and dignified rule came up against night baseball? Roadblocks, evasion, avoidance. Landis believed the night game to be unnatural and against the fundamental aspects of baseball. But the night game also smacked up against Landis's number one enemy, gambling and corruption. Since Landis was born in 1866, he grew up in a world without much artificial light. He was from the generation that feared the dark, that believed the bad elements and bad people lived in the dark. Also, how do you keep an eye on the gamblers and throw them out on their heads if you can't see them? But beyond this gambling element, night baseball offered Americans a chance, for really the first time in the history of the game, to be able to attend ball games more than once or twice a year. In the factor of accessibility, night baseball was more democratic than daytime baseball by a long shot. As the powerful ruling czar of baseball, Landis could have made a huge difference in supporting night games. But it wasn't just inaction, it wasn't just a lack of support. When Larry McPhail came to Landis in 1935 to seek permission for a night game experiment, just an experiment, Landis told him, "Over my dead body." That's about as obstructionist as you can get. And really, it was the Great Depression and the financial hardship that finally swayed him to allow the experiment in Cincinnati, which turned out to be a huge success. If there hadn't been a depression, we might not have seen night baseball for another decade, at least. But when it comes to the history and legacy of Kenesaw Mountain Landis, it's less about how outspoken he was on corruption and more about how quiet he was on the game's greatest injustice. In episode 13, I'll discuss the complex and heartbreaking final chapter of this story, what Kenesaw Mountain Landis did and did not do in the area of segregation. We'll end tonight with a listener baseball story. And moving forward, I'm going to share some of the stories in Rob Scheinkoff's book, Hey Mom, Wanna Have a Catch? This is a collection of baseball stories from a variety of people who wanted to share their experiences. This story is called Roger Bowman for the Save by Richard Astro. I was born a Yankees fan, or if not, then I became one soon thereafter. And how could it have been otherwise? I grew up on West 96th Street, just steps from the IRT on Central Park West that would get me to Yankee Stadium in 20 minutes. And this when the Yankees were the best team in baseball, in all of professional sports. Between the day when I went to my first game in the summer of 1949 and when I graduated from college 16 years later, the Yankees won 14 pennants and 9 World Series. How could a New Yorker root for anyone else? And then there was my father, a lifelong fan, whose love of the Yankees was anchored by his friendship with Lou Gehrig, whom he met at Columbia, with whom he remained friendly after Gehrig became famous, and through whom he met other Yankees, Tony Lazzeri, Earl Combs, Bob Musial, and, of course, the Babe. Many years later, my mother told me that Ruth and my father pushed my baby carriage through Central Park on weekends. Imagine being pushed by the Babe. Starting when I was old enough to walk, my father and I would have a catch on weekend mornings in that same park. However much I enjoyed those mornings with my dad, I wish Babe Ruth had been with us then. From Gehrig and later from other Yankees, my father got great box seats to games where in the late 1920s he romanced the woman who would become my mother. And 2 decades later, where he and I would see the great DiMaggio hit his last home runs and Mickey Mantle hit his first. We'd watch the infield team of Jerry Coleman and Scooter Rizzuto, old reliable Tommy Henrich, the wonderful Yogi Berra, and most of all, there was left fielder Gene Woodling, who was my childhood idol. I don't know why I settled on Woodling, but I remember following his every at-bat. Despite my father's protests, I was so enraptured with Woodling that when I registered for Social Security, I took his first name as my middle name. And now, 70 years later, I get Social Security checks payable to Richard Eugene Astro. And then, in early 1951, everything went upside down. It began when my father lost his job. Since the end of World War II, he directed the United Service for New Americans, a resettlement agency for East European immigrants. From what I learned years later, when one or more members of the House Un-American Activities Committee suggested that my father might have been a member of the Communist Party, he wasn't, and that an aunt with whom he was quite close was an active CP member, she was, they targeted him and his agency. End of story. Through a family friend, my father got a job directing a senior citizens' home in Pittsburgh, and he and I had to trade our World Series winning Yankees for the lowly Pirates, who were, at that time, the worst team in baseball. In 1952, our first full year in Pittsburgh, the Yankees won 98 games and the World Series. The Pirates won 42 and finished in last place in the National League. My father and I grew to enjoy the Pirates and cheered them on good days and bad. We admired Murray Dixon and Bob Friend, who pitched well, even if they lost nearly 40 games between them because Pirate batters couldn't hit. And our house had a large backyard, perfect for games of catch. Then, on a chilly 1953 April afternoon, just after we'd come home from an early season game which the Pirates, as usual, lost, my father suffered a fatal heart attack. The days and weeks ahead, and to this day, remain a blur. I don't remember my father's funeral. I knew I'd miss him terribly. No more games of catch in our backyard. No more weekends at Forbes Field. And worst of all, he wouldn't be there in June to take me to my school sports banquet, where I was to receive some sort of award as the goalie on the school soccer team. My mother said she would go, but that was unacceptable. Boys didn't go to those kinds of events with their mothers. At least, not then. Then my mother swung into action. She called a friend who had a friend who rented a home to baseball players. And on the night of the Fox School Sports Award banquet, Pirate pitcher Roger Bowman came to our house and took me to the event. No matter that Bowman didn't win a single game that year, that he'd won only 2 games in a 5-year big league career and had an ERA of nearly 6. Forget Gene Woodling, Roger became my hero. And what I feared would be the worst night of my life was one of the best. Roger Bowman and I arriving at the event, his having a catch with me, with several of my friends, and even with a teacher or two, his joining me on stage when I received my award. It was all wonderful. There would be tough times ahead as I navigated adolescence, absent the father with whom I was so close. But on that night, with Roger Bowman, my own Pittsburgh Pirate, my stars were all aligned, and all was right with the world. And today, some 70 years later, I still have a Roger Bowman baseball card in my desk drawer. That's all for tonight. I know this show came out a week later than I wanted, and I'm sure some of you as well. Rest assured that I'm doing my best to get them out as quickly as possible while maintaining the quality. Stay tuned for episode 13. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergi Patkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.